overall in the Chinese society, there's a crisis of confidence. I mean, these are also the unintended consequences resulting from this crackdown and the policy enforcement.
I'm extraordinarily privileged to team up with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations today to interview Professor Angela Zhang and her latest popular book, The Highwire. So let's dive into this, Professor Zhang. First of all, could you just quickly tell us, what drives you to write this new book, The Highwire, relating to China's tech regulation?
Well, I have been an antitrust lawyer for quite some time before I switched into academia. And my PhD thesis also specialized in antitrust law. So my initial academic work focused primarily on antitrust enforcement, particularly in China. And in 2021, I published my first book called Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism. And this book couldn't come out at a better timing. If you may recall, China initiated a massive regulatory crackdown against its biggest tech firms like Alibaba, starting from late 2020. And the main regulatory tool the government used is actually antitrust law, right? So there was a huge demand at that time among both the industry and the financial community, as well as the community understanding, how is China going to applies antitrust law against its own biggest tech firms? So they all turned to me because I just published a new book. And then start from then, because I got so many inquiries on a daily basis, I felt like I have been at the epicenter of this regulatory storm. And I realized that it didn't stop there. It didn't just stop at
so essentially you started with antitrust law analysis on China's tech regulation, but then you get into a book to cover broader regulatory topics for the tech industries.
Yes, because you saw that the Chinese government actually expanded its toolkit to not just include antitrust, but later data regulation. There's a wide range of data laws that were introduced during the crackdown, and also labor regulation. And we also need to consider how the tech firms themselves regulate and adapt to the government's regulations. So my book actually spent 2 chapters focused on self-regulation and governance of these tech firms. And we also look ahead and try to predict how China will regulate tech in the future. So this is a much bigger book. My second book is much bigger than the first book. Yes. But I think most importantly, the most important contribution of this book, it creates an analytical framework for us to think about more generally how China regulates. Because the law could change.
So maybe you can comment on your framework. It's called a pyramid model, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. No, the whole point of the dynamic pyramid model, the reason why I want to introduce it is because the law is very fluid in China, right? Today they have the law, they may not enforce it, right? And then tomorrow they might amend the law, right? So I want to give my readers something more that can stand the test of time for us to think about how China regulates, and as well as to predict how China will regulate in the future. Right. And so that's why that was the whole point why I want to introduce a dynamic pyramid model. Now, this model basically was inspired by the system thinking, which sees our world as a very complex and interconnected system. Okay, so basically, I'm trying to explain things are very complicated when regulators make a decision. And in this model, I basically explain, the Chinese regulatory system is characterized by 3 main features. First is hierarchy, which I use to describe the regulatory structure. Second is volatility, which I use to describe the regulatory process, which tends to be very volatile. And that gives people the impression that Chinese regulation could be very arbitrary, very unpredictable. And that leads me to explain the third distinct feature, which is fragility, right? In the sense that very often well-intentioned regulations can generate vast unintended consequences. And it often takes a long time for the policymakers to realize these consequences. And so it often led to irreparable damage.
I see. As a former lawyer in China and the US, I did a past China bar many years ago. So I totally agree with your point about the complexity and volatility, because last 20 years, China did come up with a lot of more laws and regulations and related enforcement actions, right? But the third point of fragility, right? It's less obvious, and I guess for a lot of readers, they probably will be keen to understand what does that mean. So could you go a little further into fragility?
Right, that's a very good point, right? I mean, so how do we evaluate the resilience of a particular policy intervention? I look at it with two dimensions. First is we look at, what are the side effects from the intervention? Just like taking a drug, right? I mean, it's supposed to cure a particular disease, but it might generate unintended consequences, creating all these side effects. The other dimension we look at is information lack. How long does it take for the top policymakers, the people at the very top, to realize, this is causing severe side effects, and then we need to reverse course? Now, in the Chinese system, the regulatory system, what I identify is that it tends to generate strong side effects and no information lack. Right? I mean, so by the time
So how about some example? Recently, last 2-3 years, right? China took a lot of new regulatory actions. Could you pick one particular, like a big impact action, and then you talk about the regulatory measures and the unintended consequences or the side effect, in your words?
Well, and the numerous examples, but the perfect example that I elaborated in the book is the tech crackdown, right? I mean, this crackdown lasted for unprecedented 18 months, and I actually have a lot of sympathy for the government's intervention, because there was hardly any intervention in the past decade, and then these tech firms have grown recklessly, and it's create all sorts of antitrust issues and data abuse issues, right? So I do think that the government has strong reasons to intervene. However, the way they went about it created all sorts of problems, and particularly generate huge market backlash. And you see companies like Alibaba and Tencent, they lost about 55 to 60 to 75% of the market cap during the crackdown, right? I mean, so if you look at the top 10 Chinese tech firms right now, they are much weaker in terms of their size and scale compared with what they were, before the crackdown, right? I mean, supposedly the whole point of this antitrust intervention was to inject more, trying to inject more competition in the regulatory landscape, right? I mean, we want to lower the entry barrier. We want to attract more new players into the field, but because investors have retreated, right? They have left the Chinese market. They decided it's uninvestable. So there's even less new entry into the market, and we're not facilitating, facilitating any changes in the competitive landscape. And if anything, it just entrenched the dominance of the existing incumbents, because they are the ones who are better able to deal with a lot of the regulatory compliance, whereas the smaller players will find it very difficult to do these days.
Now, talking about big players and the small players, right? Maybe we can offer another perspective to look at the valuation drop of the big guys. Maybe their models have been mature, like e-commerce of Alibaba. Right. Obviously, they try to get into new sectors like cloud computing as well to find new drivers, etc. And now the latest, obviously, is AI, right? So let's hear your views on China's regulation on AI, because globally, China probably is the first country to come up with a AI regulation. Even though recently EU comes up with a more comprehensive AI regulation, right? So what do you think about China's AI policy and the regulatory actions so far?
Right. I mean, Winston, you're absolutely right that China appears to be a pioneer in introducing some of the earliest and most comprehensive legislation on AI. Right. I mean, if you may recall back in 2021, China already introduced a comprehensive set of measures to regulate a recommendation algorithm, right?
Yes.
Algorithm that's powering
Yeah.
TikTok and and all sorts of social media apps. And a year later, China introduced the regulation to deep fake. And then last August, China became the first country in the world to have introduced a new set of rules to regulate generative AI, right? And then, by the way, China is the first country and the only country in the world to have imposed a licensing requirement for service providers to offer
Of course.
generative
Yeah.
AI services
Yeah,
to the
but this is
public,
not
right? I
new
mean,
in China, right, Angela? Yeah, because in the past, relating to blockchain technologies and other similar technologies, they also introduced a registration system, for new
yes,
projects, right, to
yes,
to be registered
yeah,
at the
yeah.
national regulators website. So the AI algorithm registration, right? It seems like a very quite consistent
Yes.
in a peculiar way. Yeah.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So that gives people the impression that China appears to be very strict. Like, I mean, but what I observe is that we can't just look at the surface. And you're absolutely right that, this kind of content moderation requirement is actually, we can see a clear path dependence in the government's regulation in the past. And in fact, whether you are looking at recommendation, algorithm legislation, or deepfake regulation, or the generative AI regulation, there's a strong emphasis on content moderation, which is the bottom line of the Chinese Communist Party because they want to maintain information control. However, when we look closely at the enforcement of the AI legislation, you will see that the government is actually quite lax, very lax, and primarily because of the institutional dynamics in China, because the government is truly vested in AI development, right? I mean, the government is simultaneously playing multiple roles in the AI ecosystem. It is a regulator, it's a policymaker, it is an investor, right? I mean, it's a
Sure.
supplier, it's a customer, it's everywhere
The
all at once.
promoter too.
So yes, right. I mean, so the government led a very strong commitment to seriously regulate this technology. And if anything, I sort of see a lot of Chinese AI legislation an enabler for the industry. And in fact, the law
Yes.
contained a lot of encouraging language and trying to send very strong signal to the industry that they're going to adopt a very cautious and tolerant approach with AI legislation. China is actually taking just like the man highwire on the cover of my book, right? So on the one hand, it is maintaining strict content moderation, information control, right? We make sure that the generative content is politically aligned with the Communist Party's value. But on the other hand, it understands the enormous benefits that can be brought about by these technologies, right? So the government is also trying to enable the technology by sending very strong, friendly policy signal. It's
Exactly.
very
Yeah.
delicate balance.
Obviously, it's
Yeah.
interesting to see that China is the first country to start a AI regulation, but it is also the country probably is most determined to promote AI innovation in China. So I totally agree with you. Kind of mixed roles of Chinese government in the tech sector, especially in the AI context. When we talk about AI, we cannot forget about data, right? Because data is the oil of the new AI economy. So what about the data regulation? All the related data training, data labeling, data storage, data cybersecurity, so on and so forth. What do you feel about China's data regulation, especially in the cross-border context?
Oh my God. I mean, this will take a long time to explain. We've been through a whole drama with China's data regulation. As you know, during the crackdown, China introduced one of the world's strictest data law. I mean, the personal information protection law after EU's GDPR, and in many ways, it's stricter than the GDPR. In fact, the highest penalty they can impose is 5% of the firm's revenue in the previous year, where GDPR only imposed 4%, up to 4%, right? I mean, and then later on, China introduced very stringent cross-border transfer rules, which really annoy a lot of the businesses operating in China, and in fact, caused some of the firms to decide to exit from the Chinese market because they think that, well, this thing, they have no idea how to comply. And it seems extremely cumbersome because this kind of cross-border data transfer is so routine in day transactions, right? I mean, just unthinkable that they need to obtain clearance from the Cyberspace Administration of China all the time. But then because of this mounting complaint, again, there is this big information lack problem. I mean, this complaint has lasted for a while, but it wasn't until late last year and early this year that China gradually began to unwind these some of the relax some of the stringent cross-border data transfer rules. However, the damage has already been done, right? I mean, those firms who decide to exit the Chinese market, they have left. They have sacked the team. They have terminated, right? I mean, so I personally just know of some big U.S. banks that decided to shut down their entire trading office in mainland China simply because of the data transfer issue, right?
Yes.
I mean, so
we certainly see that trend, right? But at the same time, you also have Tesla expanding its operation in China. How should we understand that? Does that mean like, for some foreign companies like Tesla still find it okay, doable to work with China's data and tech regulation?
Of course, right? I mean, Tesla derives a very large percent of its revenue from the Chinese market. I mean, is it over 20%? It's on top of my head, right? So China is a hugely important market for Tesla. And Tesla also incurs some data issues. As you may recall, Tesla's car was restricted from parking at a certain restricted areas like military compounds or government offices, right? I mean, so, but even for that, the Chinese government have relaxed that when Elon Musk landed in Beijing a couple of weeks ago. And so you see, it at least at this point, right? I mean, Tesla can't leave China, and China is a hugely important market for Tesla. And there's ways for Tesla to negotiate and bargain with Beijing. And by the way, Beijing also don't want to create this data don't want data regulation to eventually become a trade barrier for Tesla, because to demonstrate to the world that Chinese cars, Chinese EV should also be sold in other jurisdictions like Europe, like the United States, and data concern shouldn't be a trade barrier for these Chinese cars as well.
Yes. Okay, very good point. So this is a great transition, into some discussion about China's tech regulation in the U.S.-China context. Right, as you know, I published a book on similar topics, but the similarly provocative title, "The Digital War," how China's tech power shapes the future of AI, blockchain, and cyberspace. Right. So I want to mention this because I want to get your view about China's tech regulation in the context of the rivalry between U.S.-China. Right. I think because. When you look at the China's tech regulation, on one hand, you can say they really try to control these Chinese companies, but at the same time, they are also using the tech policies and the regulations, right, to express their industry policy views, right? Essentially, they're driving the resources and the capital in China into the sectors that they want to focus on, right? So in my book, I talked about tech regulations as a reflection of China's tech policy shift, which is consistent in your analysis in the book. I'm very glad because in your book you also talk about China's tech regulation in the context of China shifting its focus from soft tech like e-commerce, mobile entertainment, mobile payment, right, into hard tech, right, like artificial intelligence, right? So I guess the question to you is how do you think about the effectiveness of China's tech regulation in the context of industry policy objectives?
Again, I am not that optimistic about the effectiveness of the government's reorientation of the tech firms' commercial strategy. And obviously, one of the consequences, as I discussed in the book, and as you also, explain in your book, is that because of the crackdowns, my investors that flee from the consumer businesses decided this is not an area that is investable more, right? I mean, and so the money started to flow into the hard tech businesses, and even including the tech firms themselves, like Alibaba and Tencent. These are the biggest corporate investment house in China. And then they have also passively invested a lot of money in hard tech as well in recent years, right? But before they used to buy a lot of consumer tech businesses, and that's how they've grown to be this enormous size. And now they have also pivoted to hard tech, right? But because hard tech is not in their genes, so they only invest as a passive investors. And the government funds also flow into hard tech, private investors also flow into hard tech. But I think the problem, however, is that overall, the Chinese tech firm size have shrunk, right? I mean, these firms like Alibaba and Tencent, they're much smaller than they used to be. Alibaba at its peak was a firm worth $800 billion. Now it's a firm worth about $180 billion, right? I mean, it's a much smaller firm, while at the same time, the US tech firms have grown enormously due to the AI boom in the last couple of years, right? I mean, NVIDIA, now one single company is worth all the top 10 tech firms combined in China, right? I mean, so I think that on the one hand, the Chinese government seems to use this tech crackdown as an opportunity to drive this industrial policy, to try to push its tech firms towards more hardcore, more foundational tech developments. But at the same time, unfortunately, have also undermined its most dynamic tech sector and weakened the tech sector and crippled its most competitive businesses.
I see your point. As a tech investor, right? I would say size doesn't matter, but I could offer like another big difference last 2-3 years. Aside from the tech regulation, is the monetary policy. China did not open the spigot of the money printing, but the U.S. cut the rate to zero and stayed with the loose monetary policy for a long time, and that kind of monetary policy difference actually also is a factor, for the tech companies' valuation change last couple of years. But that's a much longer story, and I just offer that for more comprehensive kind of context. But I think you're right on, about the impact, the Chinese regulations impact on the Chinese tech companies, right? Because if the Chinese government wants to be a leader in advanced technologies like AI, then it has to enable the Chinese companies, right? So maybe you can quickly talk about how Chinese companies are reacting to this, and can they find their competitiveness in this regulatory environment?
Well, I mean, as an entrepreneur, we ask around, the Chinese business community these days, there's a crisis of confidence because of this serious crackdown, not just at the internet sector, but also the property sector. And there's, prior to that, there was some of the policy missteps with COVID management, right? I mean, overall in the Chinese society, there's a crisis of confidence. I mean, these are also the unintended consequences resulting from this crackdown and the policy enforcement. So it's hard. It is extremely fiercely competitive business in China, given all the economic slowdowns and this kind of institutional environment, right? So entrepreneurs are trying very hard to succeed and survive in the Chinese market, and that's why many of them are looking for overseas opportunities, right? I mean, and that's why in the past few years you see more and more Chinese firms like ByteDance, Pinduoduo, and Shein. These companies have started to look overseas, and they did phenomenally well. and in recent years, particularly conquering the overseas consumer business market, because this is something that they're really good at. And yeah.
That's a very positive note, like talking about the Chinese companies' global expansion, right? In this context, and this is perfect, for this event at the National Committee on U.S.-China relations. So maybe as a closing question, maybe you could quickly comment about the Chinese companies' global expansion and how this China's tech regulatory framework, like how does the China tech regulation framework, right, drives the future U.S.-China tech competition or even collaboration, if we so wish.
Right. I mean, I do think that Chinese tech firms are fiercely competitive overseas, particularly in the consumer tech businesses. But at the same time, because of their Chinese identity, as we all know, they're facing a lot of legal challenges. Like when TikTok was facing the ban or a divestiture dilemma in the United States at the moment, right? However, these companies, they are very resilient, they are very adaptable, and they do know how to play the games in different jurisdictions. And I have no doubt that TikTok will resort to all sorts of legal strategies in order to continue to survive and thrive in the US market, right? I mean, as to how my analytical framework, which mostly apply to how China regulates tech, because of it's driven by China's distinct regulatory system, how it might affect the Sino-US tech rivalry. If anything, I think at least what we see, the immediate and the short-term impact is that China is actually unfortunately crippling its most competitive tech firms, right? I mean, and it's actually making them weaker in the Sino-US tech rivalry, and particularly with the AI boom, and given the US very aggressive export restrictions on leading on the advanced AI chips to China, and this has further undermined China's AI development, right? I mean, so the gap between US and China is currently widening, and there is a lot of anxieties in Chinese business and the tech community about how we can stay competitive with the United States.
Yes. Now, great that you mentioned about TikTok and the AI chip sanctions, so on and so forth, right? Because these are not only questions relating to China's tech regulations, but also the U.S. tech regulations. Yes. So when you settle in USC at the West Coast, we should have another interview with you to cover both China and the U.S. tech regulations. Yes. Thank you again for your time today and your wonderful book, The Highwire, and the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. A wonderful conversation. Thank you.